Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is Philosophossum. Hope everyone's enjoying their weekend and staying safe from the virus and all that. So I recently had a debate with Mr. Anton Dybal about libertarianism. He made a video debunking a lot of the libertarian criticisms of the income tax. I made a video responding to that, which he saw, and subsequently challenged me to come on his show for a debate, which I accepted. Links to both my response video and the debate will be in the description for those of you who haven't seen them. Now, first and foremost, big thank you to Anton for giving me the time to come on his show and have a debate. I feel it was very respectful, very well spoken, and overall I feel it was a successful conversation. I feel good points were made on both sides. I had an opportunity to get my opinion out there, kind of hear more of the opposing side, and I got to learn sort of where the weaknesses in my point of view are. Overall, I feel it made for a good debate. That being said, however, a lot of points were brought up, and there's only so much you can mention in so little time. So naturally, there were simply things I didn't get around to. Some relevant things I didn't mention, or perhaps some things I did mention but didn't have a chance to fully explain, or some counter arguments from Anton that I didn't have a chance to address. So the purpose of this video here is more or less to be a follow-up video from the debate. To kind of address relevant points that weren't brought up, or perhaps to clarify and further explain points that were brought up, things like that. That being said, let's get into it. So part one of the debate deals with regulations, and I introduce my position on this issue by clarifying what I feel to be a common misconception about the libertarian position regarding this matter. Oftentimes people will say libertarians want an unregulated market. The truth of the matter is that there's simply no such thing. Without ways to carefully determine what resources are used where and how much, then in that case all production is just kind of a guessing game, and you have no way to ensure that the greatest amount of good is being done for the resources being put in. So it's not that we want an unregulated market. Far from it. We want an extremely, very carefully regulated market. So to sort of set the foundation of my side of the argument, I began by trying to establish the relevant scope of the issue. The issue isn't whether or not there's regulation, because as I've clearly established, there very well would be. The issue is more a matter of who is it that's doing the regulating. Now, of course, a lot of people want government to do all the regulating, but of course some of the opinion that regulation should be consumer focused, because in a truly free market where there's no bailouts or grants or subsidies or things like that, the only way for a business to make money is from their customers. In the free market, a business doesn't have a single dollar that wasn't given to them by a customer. So in a free market, the way that businesses would determine what to do is by feedback from their customers. You as a customer know what your needs, wants, and demands are, and you know what types of business practices you are and aren't willing to support. And chances are you know it way better than some bureaucrat in an office somewhere. The fact is, we as consumers have the power to decide what we are and aren't willing to support by voting with our money. Now, it's true that consumers don't inherently have access to all of the information they would need to make these relevant decisions. Consumers may need some help in exercising these powers that they have. But just like any other problem, this creates a market incentive for someone willing to come forth and provide a solution. There are private sector companies that inspect things for safety, that publish reviews and reports. Consumer protection and quality assurance are just commodities that can be provided by the market, just like any other commodity. Now, once I point this out, Anton initially replies by pointing out that by advocating for this type of privatized regulation system, I'm implicitly conceding that regulations are beneficial and important, a point that he does repeat later in the exchange as well. This isn't really the gotcha that he makes it out to be. I mean, conceding that there's a need for something is hardly the same thing as conceding that only government can do it. I mean, even without taking government into account at all, customers inherently prefer safe products over dangerous products, and businesses prefer to be known for being safe over being dangerous. So even without a coercive state, there's very clearly a natural demand for consumer protection type services in the market. So very clearly saying that there's a need for something or that there's benefit from something is hardly the same thing as saying only government can do it, or it wouldn't exist without government. So this point is hardly a gotcha, but Anton does follow it up with a good question. If I'll concede that there are benefits that come from consumer protection and consumer protection type services, then why do away with government regulations? I didn't mention this during the debate, although I probably should have. but they're not mutually exclusive. Having more private sector consumer protection doesn't necessarily mean you have to get rid of government regulations. You can have private and public sector services compete alongside each other, kind of like how the post office competes with UPS and FedEx, but I want to focus on the benefits that private sector-based consumer protection has over government regulation. So at this point in the debate, I start to list off reasons to Anton why I believe that private sector regulation would work better than the government. And of course, the first one is choice. I mean, it's probably the biggest advantage you have in the private sector over government with regards to not just regulations, but pretty much anything. If you want a drug approved for sale, you have to go through the FDA. If you want your house inspected for safety, you have to go through the local zoning board. Well, what if I think I can do it better, or cheaper, or more efficiently? Or what if the FDA becomes bottlenecked because there's a whole bunch of new medications trying to get on the market? Well, in the free market, you have the right to choose. If I was a drug company and I wanted a new drug to be tested and approved, I wouldn't have to go through the FDA. I could go through another company that could test it probably better, cheaper, more efficiently. And there's a good chance that they would, because in a competitive environment where you have choice, there's no pressure on you to make sure that your inspections are done thoroughly, quickly, accurately, because if there's someone else out there who can do it better, they have the competitive advantage. Right now, it costs several $1,000s and takes several years for a drug to get approved by the FDA. I have a feeling that would change if they had to compete with the private sector. And yeah, freedom of choice is the first benefit that immediately came to mind, as with any other government service, but another one, and this I feel will probably be the most important one, and that is these private sector alternatives are non-coercive or voluntary. And I think this is where the difference in mentality between libertarians and authoritarians really comes out. You see, there's the carrot strategy and there's the stick strategy. Authoritarians are rather fond of the stick strategy. You have to behave this way or we'll punish you. Whereas libertarians prefer the carrot approach. If you do this good thing, we'll reward you. And the carrot strategy, in my opinion, generally has better results. I mean, which would you rather have? A system where people are punished for being bad, or a system where people are rewarded for being good? Now, you could argue that both are necessary to an extent, and I wouldn't necessarily disagree, but generally speaking, it would seem like being rewarded for good behavior is not only more pleasant, but also more effective. There's a fundamentally different type of relationship you have between the regulators and the businesses in the two different approaches. The current regulatory framework we have is very combative, very antagonistic. These regulators come into the business and they give demands and threaten punishment. They say, we will hurt you if you don't comply with our demands. And it's no wonder that business owners tend to turn their nose up at regulations. I mean, you're issuing demands and threats. Heck, if you didn't have a badge or uniform, people would take you as a common street thug or an extortionist from the mafia. So business owners are essentially spending more money to comply with these regulations that were arbitrarily imposed onto them. They're spending extra money, going through extra hassle and getting nothing out of it, and it's no wonder regulations are viewed as burdensome and unwelcome. So what we have now is a combative relationship, whereas what I propose is a cooperative relationship. So when these private inspectors and quality control companies come in, they're not threatening punishment, but rather offering rewards. They're basically saying, if you do comply with our standards, then you will receive something good out of it. Specifically what these rewards are, well, they can be different things. It can be a straight up cash grant, it can be a seal of approval, it can be advertising, and it's one of the nice things about the free market. Because it's free, because you have freedom to choose and sort of adapt to your circumstances, these private regulators would be free to apply any number of rewards based on what they feel would most motivate the customer they're dealing with. For example, I used to volunteer at our town's visitor center, and we had a list of restaurants that we would recommend to people who would visit. In order for a restaurant to be considered being put on this list, they would have to have, certifications from the county health inspection board. This is just one example, but if you use your imagination, there's probably all different types of systems you could come up with where we could reward businesses for good behavior rather than punish them for bad behavior. Now, of course, a lot of you are probably thinking right now, well, what difference does it make which approach we use? If the ultimate end result is that the business is complying with these standards, what does it matter whether it's to avoid punishment or to gain reward? In fact, those of you who closely follow Hobbes or Machiavelli will probably make the argument that the punishment will be more effective. But just think for a moment, under which type of system would there be more general compliance with? Because the punishment approach is combative. In this relationship, the business sees the regulators as an adversary, as a punisher, as someone introducing something bad. I mean, without even going into the economic details, just from a pure psychological standpoint, as soon as the regulator comes in and says, do this or we'll do something bad to you, because because of that flight or fight response, the business owner will consciously or not want to resist and evade these regulations. Contrast this with the system where the regulations are based on reward, a system where the regulators introduce something good for the business. Now we have a situation where the business owner is getting something out of the extra effort and expense they put into complying with their standards. Not only would they no longer resist the regulations, but they'd see them as a good thing. They'd probably go out of their way to be regulated. Imagine food companies calling up the FDA and asking to be inspected. Generally speaking, you'll have an easier time getting people to comply with your standards if they're doing so because they want to rather than because they have to. So if you've seen the debate, you'll know Anton kind of interjected while I was making this point, so I didn't really have an opportunity to fully explain it. But that's the basic idea I was trying to get across. The idea that you'll have a much easier time having compliance if your relationship is cooperative rather than combative. So like I mentioned, at this point, Anton does interject and kind of moves the conversation in another direction, but there were additional benefits that the private sector offers over government that I was going to list as well. Another benefit is that they're decentralized, and I do mention this point later in the debate, but I don't really discuss it in detail. Basically, the issue with a lot of these regulatory agencies is that it's a very heavily centralized system. If you want to sell a drug in the United States, it must be approved by the FDA. So every new drug that a company comes up with has to be funneled through this one agency, and this really bottlenecks the process, resulting in extra expense and time that company could have been using developing other new medication. We experienced this type of problem in my town a few years ago. Our town was experiencing a bit of an economic boom, which resulted in a whole lot of construction going on at once. We had neighborhoods expanding, we had people putting in sheds, swimming pools, patios, things like that, and of course all this stuff has to be inspected and approved by the county building inspector. And because you have to have your construction inspected by this specific agency, you can't go to any others. Well, naturally there's a massive backlog, and some people had to wait a couple months before they could just build their fucking shed. If there was a multitude of different building inspection companies, how big of a problem do you think this would have been? It's another thing, and it's also a common argument I make against stuff like Medicare for All, that government services typically aren't good at handling demand spikes, because they typically don't have to worry too much about demand. You have to pay them whether or not you want their service, whether or not you use their service, whether or not you like their service. And as a result of this lack of market feedback, it's very easy for them to get backlogged if there's a huge demand for a particular service. Which sort of flows into the next reason I was going to list, and that is these private regulators would be more customer focused. So when you're a regulator or a quality control firm, you actually have two sets of customers. You have the consumers who want to know what are the best businesses to work with, and you have the businesses that want their quality of their service confirmed. Now on the business side of things, the interaction is all one direction. The regulatory agencies give demands upon businesses, but the businesses don't really give any feedback to the regulators. So if there's a regulation that's particularly strenuous, that they feel majorly impacts their ability to operate, or suppose they find a better or more efficient way of achieving the same level of quality but at a lower cost, but this different way ultimately deviates from the regulations being imposed. In that situation, the business is more or less SOL because these regulations aren't suggestions, you're stuck with them. Now on the customer side of things, there's even less interaction. These regulatory agencies interact very little with the consumers that they're supposedly serving to protect. And since a lot of these regulations fall under administrative law or administrative agencies, they're virtually isolated from any sort of election or democratic process. This, combined with the fact that we're forced to pay them whether we want to or not, results in these agencies being very insular from the very citizens they're sworn to protect. Yeah, these agencies have, contact information, phone numbers, emails, way to get in touch with them. Like if I think a food company is doing something unhealthy or unsafe, I can call the FDA and report them, and there's a chance that they'll do something about it, but far from a guarantee. So on the business side of things, the interaction is one way. On the customer side of things, the interaction is practically non-existent, and this would all change if the system was privatized. So these private inspectors or regulatory companies would treat the businesses and consumers they work with like they would any other business treats its customers. There'd be a constant communication feedback on both sides, and they would be very responsive. This is more or less guaranteed because of the final reason I was going to mention, and that is these private regulatory companies are actually responsible. While proponents of the FDA will often brag about how many unsafe drugs they've kept off the market, they at the same time seem to ignore all the unsafe drugs drugs that slip through the cracks and still make it onto the market. And it's not like this is some kind of one-off fluke incident. Every time you turn on the TV, there's always a commercial of some attorney reaching out to victims of some sort of drug that was passed and allowed onto the market by the FDA. Now in these commercials, the lawyers usually emphasize going after the pharmaceutical company, but if the FDA has a responsibility to keep these unsafe drugs off the market in the first place, wouldn't they be just as responsible? And that's just the thing about these private quality control firms. If they flake on their responsibility or don't properly inspect everything before they pass off on it, you as the consumer can hold them responsible, either directly by suing them or indirectly by not doing business with them, neither of which is really an option for these regulatory agencies. So that's the full list of reasons why I believe that private sector quality control firms will typically be better than government regulations. Now back when I was discussing the second reason, I did mention Anton did interject and kind of move the conversation in a different direction. I posited these private regulatory agencies being voluntary is a good thing, and Anton felt to the contrary. He felt that them not having the force of law, to use his own words, ultimately rendered them ineffective. And he went on this whole tug at your heartstrings spiel about how there'd be deaths and this and that, and there were kind of two assumptions being made there. The first one being that the force of law was needed in order to be effective at regulating these companies, which I've already discussed. I've explained in detail why I believe a positive, reward-based approach is more effective, but of course, being absolutely realistic, not everyone is going to be swayed by positive incentives. If somebody doesn't hold up their end of an agreement, or takes advantage of someone else, or does something that actively hurts somebody, then obviously measures need to be put in place to correct that. So it wouldn't necessarily be the case that these agencies wouldn't have the force of law at all. Rather, the force of law would be created using a contract. And I briefly give an example of how such a contract could look. And in another video of mine where I've responded to Joe Rogan's interview with Dave Rubin, I use the same example to address a similar point brought up there. Basically how it would work is this. There'd be a three-way contract between the customer, the builder, and the inspector. The builder would only get paid if the inspector they agree upon signs off on the house, and once the inspector signs off on the house, the liability, if it collapses, transfers to them. So this gives the builder an incentive to build properly, and the inspector an incentive to inspect properly. Anton brings up the issue of, well, what would happen if the house collapses, everyone dies, and there's no one left to litigate or go after the negligent people involved? Well, in that case, the builder would go after the inspector, because just as the customer was relying on the inspectors to keep their home safe, the builder was relying on them to keep their reputation safe. That construction company is now on record as having built a home that killed a family, and they were trusting the inspectors to prevent that from happening. So it very much makes sense that such a clause would be in this contract. In addition to this, it's also possible that the family has some sort of life insurance policy that in the event of a full incapacitation, that is, the whole family dies, nobody's around to litigate, they can authorize on their behalf a coroner to investigate what happened, and the life insurance company would on their behalf take action accordingly. And this is sort of one potential answer to the question, well, how is murder dealt with in anarcho-capitalism? Because this isn't limited to a house collapsing. It could be any situation where there's full incapacitation of ability to litigate. And the life insurance company would have every motivation to do this. Their insureds are now dead. They're no longer getting premium payments off of them, so it's in their interest to now go after whomever the murderer is. Now, Anton was under the impression that when drafting this life insurance policy, you would have to account for every possible thing that could potentially kill the family. Not necessarily. You could simply say, in the event of incapacitation, I hereby grant my insurance company power of attorney in order to seek redress of this issue on my behalf. And this would cover any situation where you were incapacitated due to someone else's negligence, not just death. Suppose that the house collapsed on you, but instead of killing you, it made you comatose. This power of attorney would still kick in, because even though you're not dead, you're still not in a situation where you can go after the people who are responsible. So the issue of who goes after these people who are responsible if the house collapses and, say, incapacitates everyone is a valid issue, but it's one that can be solved in any number of ways because the free market gives you that flexibility. And this is another point I mentioned in the debate. The issue of who goes after someone when their victim is incapacitated would exist under any system. It would be just as reasonable to ask, in the event that the family's killed, who goes after the government, as it would be who goes after these private inspectors. Because both parties are essentially playing the same role, it makes sense that they would both have the same liability if the inspection wasn't carried out properly. The response from Anton frankly strikes me as unsatisfactory. He basically said the government would hold the government responsible. And I do mention this in the debate. Anytime you have a situation where entity X holds entity X responsible for their malfeasance, you have a potential conflict of interest, and that should raise a red flag. So Anton addresses this potential conflict of interest by claiming that the government has multiple layers of checks, as well as outside organizations that also check them. So I believe at this point in the debate, this topic was kind of being wrapped up, so I didn't really get a chance to counter it. If these types of checks work to keep the government in line, why can't they also be applied to these other private companies? I mean, if you think about it, that's sort of what I'm advocating for. Within companies, I think there should be multiple layers of checks and external organizations monitoring them. I mean, if you believe these measures are sufficient to keep government in check, well, there's no more reason to believe that they won't keep these private companies in check. In fact, if anything, the external organizations would be more effective on the private companies because they rely on their public opinion to make money. Whereas Congress has a lower approval rating of some of the most hated companies in America, and they still get paid. Also, notice how Anton says that yes, there are internal checks within government, but he doesn't really explain what they are or how they work or go into detail. Like, I can go into detail and explain how the internal checks in the private sector would work. Suppose your R&D department insists on using this inferior product design in order to save a couple bucks on production. Before they release this product to the public, the PR department does some quick research and figures out that releasing this inferior product will actually hurt their brand and not produce any profit. So yeah, private sector companies do have these same types of internal checks. This isn't something exclusive to government. This type of system where we just have faith that the government will do everything by the books and hold themselves responsible doesn't strike me as reassuring as a system where I can directly hit these people in the wallet. So again, this point was kind of brought up as we were kind of shifting topics, which is why I didn't really offer a rebuttal to it at the time, but this is basically my rebuttal. So in addition to the criticism of what would happen if the entire family dies, another criticism he has of the system I propose is he feels it's overly complicated. And if complication is an issue with my system, then it sure as hell is one with yours. The Federal Register, that is the collection of all regulations passed by the federal government from all federal agencies, currently has 8,000 pages. Not 8,000 individual regulations, 8,000 pages of regulations. And that's just the federal level. That's not even all the state and local regulations that also apply. Now, of course, the common rebuttal to this point is, sure, there are a lot of regulations, but not all of them apply to your business. But how would you know unless you read them? Because remember, ignorance of law is no excuse. If they pass a regulation and you're not aware of it, and you get busted, oh well. Our current regulatory system is so complicated that companies actually have to expend resources understanding the regulations. Not even complying with them, just understanding them imposes costs on the businesses. Now, of course, big companies can hire a whole team of lawyers to read through all these regulations, interpret them, understand them, make sure they're in compliance. Smaller companies don't really have these types of resources though, so there's a good chance we'd see complication actually be reduced if we largely privatize the regulatory system. And even if it were true that these contracts would be too complicated for the average person to understand, well, again, that's just another problem that a willing entrepreneur can come along and profit from. We already have expert contract drafters or contract attorneys that help business people or even lay people draft contracts, try and make sure that the contracts are effective and cover all potential contingencies. And in a system where we don't have a bar association monopolizing the practice of law, this service would be cheaper and a hell of a lot more available. So even if it were true that this type of contract would be too complicated for the average person to comprehend, that doesn't mean that there's no feasible way to implement it, and it sure as hell doesn't mean we should replace it with something more complicated. Anton tries to present his system as the more simple and effective way of doing things. You know, the government comes in, they mandate a standard, they enforce compliance, they punish people who violate it, and everything just works like clockwork. And it sounds great the way he presented it. A lot of this stuff sounds great surface level, and that's kind of why I was stumped during that one part of the debate. He said something to the effect of, wouldn't it be simpler or more effective just to have the full force of the government come in and deal with everything? And it took me a minute to kind of think of a way to respond. Yeah, that's one of the additional challenges of debating someone live versus pre-recording things. When you're pre-recording stuff, you can kind of take your time thinking about what do I want to say, how do I want to phrase it, what do I want to emphasize, whereas when you're in a debate, you're kind of expected to come up with an answer on the spot. So I was in this situation where it's like, oh shit, he phrased that really good. He painted his solution as the simple one and mine as the complicated one, so I need to think of a way to respond that sounds equally convincing. And once I had a minute to kind of gather my thoughts, I basically said, yeah, sure, surface level, it may seem like the better, more effective option. And I think that's one of the things that draws people to regulations. Like, the idea sounds good. The government just rides in on a white horse, pulls out their shiny sword, and makes a companies play nice. But when you consider all the points I've made, the incentive structures, the lack of customer feedback, the lack of accountability, the resources you need to enforce it, all of this and more just makes it all crumble. And his whole strategy of appealing to what's obvious or what's apparent strikes me as odd for someone like Anton to use. It just seems strange for someone who makes a big deal out of being a skeptic to resort to these types of strategies. But that's a minor nitpick, I don't get too bogged down into that. The main point to take home here is that the reason regulations seem appealing to a lot of people is because they like the idea of having less responsibility. Yeah, Anton is correct that consumers may have to exercise a little bit more responsibility in a truly free market. But is that a worthwhile trade-off? All of the alternatives to government regulations I've suggested, like reviews and reports and seals of approval, these things are all tools that help expand the ability of consumers to vote with their wallets. But regulations don't expand consumer power of choice. On the contrary, they limit them. See, people who propose or support regulations, they often focus on how they affect the businesses. Little, if any, thought is ever given to the customers who work with those businesses. When people demand that the government regulate the economy, it may seem like you're giving up your own responsibility, but you're actually giving up your own freedom of choice. And losing this freedom of choice to regulations has created a lot of detrimental consequences, not for businesses, but for consumers. We have to pay increased prices because these companies have to spend more money complying with regulations, and a lot of people die because a medication that could potentially save their life is trapped behind FDA red tape. There's an old fable of a guy named Faust who gave his soul to the devil in exchange for limitless knowledge. From this we get the term Faustian bargain, which is a term used to describe any sort of deal that appears good on the surface, but isn't all it's cracked up to be. Government regulations sound nice because we would have less responsibility as consumers to hold companies accountable and make sure our products are safe. But what actually happens is we lose a lot of the freedom we have to make these types of decisions, and as I've demonstrated, there's still no guarantee that these regulations will hold these companies responsible. Now, another point that's brought up is, would these companies be inherently motivated to do a good job absent regulations? Like, do these companies actually care about providing a good quality product, or could they give a fuck less and just want profit? The way the left likes to portray this issue is totally inaccurate. First of all, they present these as if they're mutually exclusive alternatives, as if taking pride in what I do entails me not making a profit off of it. And I'm of the opinion that most professionals do take pride in the work that they do. And if you were to go onto a college campus and go around asking students why they picked the degree that they did, very few of them would probably tell you that it's because this particular field is profitable. Now, the amount of money they would make by picking a certain career field probably did play a factor in their decision making, but most likely what they'll answer will have something to do with passion or interest. There's tons of examples of people giving up higher paying jobs so that they can do something that they enjoy. I mean, I don't think a whole lot of people put the time, effort, and education into something with the intention of being terrible at it. But I mean, it's just a basic fact of logic that you need to provide something of good quality in order to have customers to make money. I mean, even if someone had no inherent passion in what they did, or didn't take any pride in their work and only cared about the profits, even then they're really not going to make that much money if they're known for providing a shitty product or service. So even under this super cynical view of human nature, yeah, people are still going to want to provide a high quality service or product. And of course the average consumer isn't going to know everything they need to know to protect themselves, but like I said, the solution to that isn't to take away their freedom of choice, but to enhance it using tools like reports and reviews. And I'm not necessarily positing this private alternative to government regulations because I believe that people are naturally greedy and want to screw each other over. But there is that reality element to it that, yeah, even the most honest and hardworking people who take pride in their work, even they're subject to human vice like the rest of us, and that temptation to cut corners to increase profit is always going to be there. And sometimes it's not even always malicious intent. I mean, we're all human, honest mistakes do happen, so even in a situation where people are mostly honest and there is an inherent incentive to provide a high quality service, there would still be a need for quality control of some sort. So the bottom line here is that the way the left typically portrays this issue, are companies out to service you or make a profit, is just completely inaccurate and misleading. So in addition to sounding good on the surface, another thing that attracts people to these regulations is emotions. Yes, in addition to playing into into your fear, they also play into your empathy. A common strategy here is to cite historical examples. They'll cite some historical example of a tragic event and say this is why we need regulations. And to really make this strategy effective, they describe the historical event using very emotive language. Like in the debate, you heard Anton sort of describe the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. People died slowly and horribly. Now, anytime anyone uses historical examples, there's a few things you have to take into consideration. The first thing you have to consider is the accuracy of the historical sources. Like who's reporting it, what was the media like at the time, are there any other alternative sources that provide a different point of view? And since you're using these as examples as to why we need regulations, you're sort of implicitly arguing that if it weren't for regulations, these types of events would continue to happen. And that's kind of what you have to establish when you use these types of arguments. For example, suppose that prior to this particular event happening, there was a downward trend on these types of events typically happening, especially before the regulation was passed. That would definitely weaken the case that were it not for these regulations, these types of problems would continue to exist. So right off the bat, these are some of the issues you have with citing historical sources. Anyways, he lists 3 historical events in particular. Now, being intellectually honest, I did have to admit that I didn't know much of the historical background regarding them. Save for the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. That one I happen to be aware of because I'm very pro-union. I'm a huge advocate of unions. I think they run circles around government labor regulations when it comes to protecting workers' rights, at least when they themselves aren't being shackled by regulations. I mean, how often do big companies make an anti-OSHA propaganda video? And the unfortunate thing about the Triangle Factory is that fire occurred in a place that was very non-union friendly. Unions are often banned by government. In fact, after the fire happened, union protesters were outside the factory demanding better conditions. The government sent police in to stop them. And the types of conditions Anton describes that existed in the factory at the time, people were locked inside, they had to work 12 hours a day with no breaks, things like that. You didn't see conditions like that in places that were more union friendly. If unions were inhibited by government, there's a very good chance the outcome of that Triangle Factory fire would have been much different. And that's the thing. I admittedly didn't know much about the historical context of those events, but I don't really need to, because my answer as to what to do in those situations is the same. Use voluntary, free market-based solutions. Stefan Molyneux makes this type of argument in a debate he had with somebody. He basically said, I don't know the details of all the circumstances, but I don't really need to. The logic and economics behind the free market was and always will be the same. He said something to the effect of, and this is not a verbatim quote, but the market will naturally encourage a solution best fitting of the circumstances. I don't know a whole lot about the circumstances these people dealt with, and while Anton may know more than me about these events, he doesn't know everything about them. None of us do. None of us were there. None of us knew what the business owner's situation was or what the employee's situation was. Even looking at modern day events, there's simply no way to know everything about everybody's circumstances. And that's the advantage that the free market has. Everybody's free to go out and find a solution that works best for them given what they have to deal with. And that's sort of the problem with regulations. It's a one-size-fits-all solution. Authoritarians get this whole mindset that there's only one specific solution to any given problem, and that their solution is the right one for everybody every time that problem happens. The truth is, reality isn't so simple. A lot of problems are very context specific, and seldom is there a silver bullet solution. Something that works in one case may not necessarily work in another case. For example, and this is an example Anton actually uses in the debate, because of the Triangle Factory fire, there's now regulations mandating sprinklers in all buildings. Now, in a case of a clothing factory like the Triangle Factory, that may very well have saved lives, but what if we're in a chemical plant? A lot of chemical-based fires can't actually be extinguished with water, so the sprinklers would best case scenario be ineffective, or could possibly even spread it around to make it worse. So yeah, in the free market, there's no right way of doing things, but that's because in reality, there's no right way of doing things. That's kind of the whole point. Going back to the example of the building inspector, the three-way contract I propose as a solution is a potential solution. If Anton feels this is an overly complicated way of doing it, he would be free to innovate and come up with something that works better. And we really seem kind of hammer home this whole idea that there's only one specific solution to this problem. When he continues to use this emotive language, people thought, oh, if only there were regulations that could have prevented this. And this is part of a strategy that's very commonly used by authoritarians on both the left and the right. They want to try and paint people who are against their specific solution to the the problem as if they're somehow apathetic. Like, if I'm against mandatory sprinklers, that means that I somehow am apathetic towards all the people who died in the Triangle factory fire. Well, no, all these deaths were tragic and surely preventable, but I'm not saying do nothing about these problems. I'm simply offering an alternative solution and I feel would be more effective. Not to be rude or anything, but frankly it strikes me as a little bit disrespectful to be using gravestones as political fodder. Like, we mostly see this from the gun control crowd, like, this many people died from this tragic mass shooting, so we need to ban guns. So next I did mention the cult of the omnipotent state, and anyone who watches Shane Killian's channel will be familiar with this concept. It's basically the idea that the state somehow has these special magical powers that the rest of us don't, and anytime a law is enacted, it will happen. Now, it's not necessarily to suggest that people believe government actually does have magical powers, but people have a tendency to kind of not think through the logistics of, okay, how is this going to be enforced? How is this going to be implemented? I mentioned that people often have unrealistic views of government, that they see it as this magic guardian angel that's always watching over them with all these benevolent intentions. It appeared as if Anton was interpreting this as me attempting to strawman him. Not necessarily. I was more offering this just as a way to explain that this is how authoritarians tend to think, or this is how people tend to view the state, not necessarily that this is how Anton was viewing the state. So I thought I'd just quickly offer that as some clarification on that point. And even though Anton might not see the state as all-powerful, or all-benevolent, or all-effective, he very clearly seems to place a far greater level of trust in the state than he would any other private sector entity. And I sort of mentioned this in my response to Joe Rogan's interview with Dave Rubin. Even if you concede that the state isn't completely perfect or completely powerful or completely benevolent, you still believe that they have benevolence and powers above your average Homo sapien, which is still a logical consistency problem. And of course Anton makes the point, well, even if these regulations aren't 100% effective at stopping the problem, if they're even only 50% effective or even 10% effective, that's still lives being saved, so why not still have them? This kind of assumes that these regulations are only producing benefits and not producing any harm as well. As I've mentioned, these regulations usually do raise the cost of doing business or limit consumer choice. So it's not enough just to say, oh, well, these regulations are saving some lives, so they're worth having. Because whatever benefit these regulations could be producing could be only marginal compared to the greater amount of damage that they're doing. It's not enough just to look at some marginal amount of benefit that something produces and says, yeah, this is worth doing. You have to take into account the drawbacks and consider it as a whole. Simply looking at how much benefit it produces is just overly simplistic. And he kind of wraps up all his views on regulations by saying that these regulations are forms of progress, that they came about as a result of these tragic events, and trying to do away with them is the elimination of progress. And I respond simply by saying this is an overly simplistic way of looking at it. First of all, what do you mean by progress? Progress is hardly an objective concept. What's progress to one person may be different from what's progress to another person. That's why we have free markets, so that people are free to pursue what they feel to be the most productive thing to accomplish, I guess you could put it. And progress isn't exactly a linear path. There's different paths you can take for progress. Yeah, you know what, I think action should be taken in response to these tragic events, but just because I want to take a different path or try a different solution doesn't necessarily mean I'm anti-progress. And suppose we do come up with a solution that ends up working better or more efficiently than these regulations. Wouldn't that end up being closer to actual progress and what you cling on to being more of an illusory form of progress? Because that's totally possible. It's possible a better or more efficient way of doing things can hit the scene, and then at that point you may look back and realize what you thought was progress isn't actually so. So now we get to the second part of the debate. This is the part involving economic issues. And just like in the first part, I begin by sort of setting out the foundation for my position. And I do this by just generally providing a brief explanation of what the libertarian viewpoint is on economics, sort of where we believe property rights come from, the fact that you own yourself, therefore you own your time and labor, therefore you own the results of your time and labor, so you own your property. That's a highly condensed version. The full version is very nuanced and technical, but I feel that sufficiently gets the main points across. So now Anton here is a progressive. And the issue with progressives is that they accept our social views, but not our economic views. So they agree with us insofar as you have a right to your person, so you have the right to do whatever drugs you want, get an abortion, things like that. But if the government feels like you're making too much money, they should all just help themselves to it. And well, the problem with taking this viewpoint is that our economic views logically follow from our social views. I mentioned this in my response to that one Young Turks video. Basically, since we believe that you own yourself, that you have a right to your time and labor, nobody can coerce you into doing anything against your will. So our social views would imply that slavery is wrong. And if you believe slavery is wrong, then you kind of have to believe in property rights. Because when progressives make this argument that they agree with our social views but not our political views, they kind of draw this strange conclusion that directly taking advantage of someone else's time and labor is wrong, but doing it after the fact indirectly is just fine. I make the argument that since your property comes about as a result of your time and labor, to interfere with someone else's property rights is essentially secondhand slavery. And this is sort of where the conversation segues into the income tax. Because if you think about it, the income tax is kind of a form of slavery. The state is claiming a right to a portion of time and labor that you perform. So the idea that there's some portion of labor that you perform that someone else has the right to just take, that kind of implies slavery. Because according to the government, you don't own that portion of your time and labor, they do. And this sort of gets into the issue of whether or not taxation is theft. I preface this point by saying that there's two issues that are often confused, whether or not taxation is theft and whether or not taxation is justified, because theft is by definition taking someone else's property without their consent. And this is important to emphasize because whenever you say taxation is theft, people often pull out these defenses that are 100% irrelevant. They say, oh, you get things in return, you benefit from it, it's for the greater good of society. None of this has anything to do with whether or not taxation is theft. Now, these things may make good justifications for taxation because, as I've mentioned in my response video, it's foreseeable that there are certain situations, such as a starving man going into a grocery store, grabbing a few things off the shelf without paying for them. It's possible to argue that there are certain situations in which some greater interest overrides the consent of the person whose property you're taking. But unless you're specifically arguing that I gave the government permission to take my money before they took it, then you're not arguing that taxation isn't theft, you're arguing for some other justification for it. Now, of course, he counters this by arguing that, well, a majority of us agree to it. Okay, well then that means taxation isn't theft for a majority of people, it doesn't mean it's not theft across the board. He then says, well, getting 100% of the consent of everybody in a country simply isn't feasible, so we kind of have to have some people who have the money taken from them against their will. Again, this misses the point. It's my money. Not a majority of society's money, but my money. So I'm the person whose permission you need if you're going to take it. Then, he makes appeals to democracy and society and all this and that. And then I straight up ask, okay, are gangbangs rape? Because when people make these arguments about like tacit consent or consent of the majority or democracy or society or this or that, the implication you're sort of making is that consent of the collective or group takes precedence over the consent of the individual. Now, of course, Anton kind of laughed at my whole question here, but the idea was sort of get across the morality of putting consent of the collective over consent of the individual. Also, Anton confuses gangbangs and orgies, but that's a minor point. But yeah, he makes these appeals to the democracy and the collective and this and that. It's like people get this idea in their head from one place or another that democracy is like objectively the best form of government. Like, if you don't like democracy, you must favor tyranny. And here's the truth of the matter, there's no difference. The laws are still based on arbitrary opinion rather than objective morality. All you're doing is substituting one tyrant for 51% of the population. And of course Anton says, well, there should be some restrictions. It shouldn't be all-out mob rule. And here's sort of the problem with that whole idea of limited democracy, and that is how exactly do you go about determining what those restrictions should be? This presents somewhat of a Euthyphro problem. If these restrictions are determined by society or the people, then it's no different from mob rule. That would utterly fail to address the issue at hand because the restrictions are coming from the very mob that they're intended to restrict. They could roll back at any time those restrictions if they so decided. If you believe, however, that these restrictions should be based on logic rather than the whims of society, then you're conceding that natural rights exist, because that's exactly what we libertarians argue when we advocate for the non-aggression principle, that morality can be derived from pure logic. So when you argue for this form of limited democracy and you ask where the limits come from, your options are either completely fail to address the problem at hand, demand, or basically admit to libertarianism. Because if these restrictions don't come from society or they don't come from logic, where else could they come from? And in my opinion, I don't believe democracy is the best form of government. Far from it, I think it's actually one of the worst, because it gives people this phony illusion that they're the ones who are in control. Like, at least under a monarchy or dictatorship, there's one jackass in charge, and if they fuck up, you know who to go after. Whereas democracy is just so convoluted, if someone fucks up, where do you go? I mean, not only do people not blame the people in charge, but they blame themselves. Oh, we were in charge and we didn't make the right decisions. All you have to do is vote differently, even though voting statistically has been proven not to really change much of anything. So what do I think is the best system of government then? I sort of agree with Plato, not just in his criticisms of democracy, but I believe public office should be based on merit rather than elections, because then it becomes a matter of who's most fit for the position versus who's more popular. I'm like Robert Nozick. I think an ideal government would operate like a business, so it would hire based on merit instead of elections, it would keep a balanced budget and make a profit, and it would only take your money if you agree to it. Which sort of ties into the next point brought up, which is regarding voluntary taxation. So in the video that I was responding to, Anton seems to equate voluntary taxation with donations. Well, yeah, the government could have some sort of donation program set up to, for programs that help the poor and things like that, but the crux of it would be you'd only pay for the government services that you specifically use. So if you send your kids to a private school, you wouldn't have to pay for public education. If you get healthcare through your employer, you wouldn't have to pay for Medicare. If you have an IRA or annuity, you wouldn't have to pay for Social Security. If you're a member of a union, you wouldn't have to pay for OSHA, etc., etc. So why is it exactly that I advocate for voluntary taxation? Well, it's simple. The rest of us, literally the rest of us, need consent before we take somebody else's money. Government is made up of the same Homo sapiens as you and me. Shouldn't morality apply to them too? I mean, think about it. Literally every other entity, every business, every other organization can make enough money to operate on a voluntary basis. Same goes for your average working person. You don't go up to your boss pointing a gun at them and saying pay me or else. You enter into a voluntary agreement where it's like, okay, you pay me this much and I'll work for you. If literally the rest of us can operate on a voluntary budget, there's no reason government can't. And of course, that's largely the moral side of it. There's also a lot of benefits that come from this voluntary taxation system. I was going to explain them, but I was kind of cut off there. But one of the biggest problems with the income tax is that there's no feedback mechanism. Anyone who's passed first grade economics will know the law of supply and demand and the equilibrium point. Basically, the higher the price of a commodity, the more people are willing to sell it. The lower the price, the more people are willing to buy it. Where these two opposing interests meet creates an equilibrium point that determines not only the optimal price, but optimal quantity for that particular commodity. The reason this works is because the demand curve can move. There's a way for me as a consumer to opt out or get the same service from somebody else. Now, in the case of the income tax, because the government's just kind of helping themselves my money and retroactively providing me these services, the government's going in blindfolded. There's no way to determine the optimal quantity or price. So you'll have situations where the government is either charging more for something than it's worth or misallocating resources, putting too many or too little resources towards a good or service it's needed. If we were to make taxation voluntary, now there is a way for market feedback to operate. We would effectively remove this blindfold from the government, and they would now have a mechanism to determine, okay, more resources are needed for this program, less for that program, and we'd have a choice. And that's the main reason libertarians criticize taxation. There's this very common straw man that people who criticize taxation want a freeload or want free stuff from the government or this or that. Well, first of all, if libertarians did want free shit from the government, we wouldn't be so adamantly against welfare. Second of all, the main reason we're against taxation is because it's coercive. We don't have a choice. I'm more than willing to pay for the government services that I take advantage of or use or want. I'm not one of those super hardcore libertarians that argues that literally everything the government does is bad, but I'd very much appreciate just having a choice in the matter, because everybody hates paying taxes, not just libertarians. In fact, even progressives like the idea of taxes more than they do paying them. And this isn't because people want free shit from the government or because people are unwilling to fund government, it's because they don't have a choice. Now at this point, Anton kind of interjects and says he feels that's more an argument for his position. Well, not really. I mean, being complacent with a system that most people hate versus innovating, trying to find a better alternative, I mean, that just seems like a no-brainer to me. I mean, Anton was saying about how libertarians are anti-progress. I mean, let's keep a system that most people hate instead of trying to replace it with something better. I mean, how much more anti-progress can you get than that? I mean, libertarians are all about progress. We are all about innovation, trying new things, replacing old things with things that could possibly work better. That's what we're all about. Speaking of innovation, that's another benefit you get from voluntary taxation. Because the government would now have to compete with the private sector, there'd be pressure on them to innovate. To see what I mean by this, for a moment, compare the post office and the DMV. At which do you typically have a more pleasant experience? Well, at the post office, the line typically moves quicker, the employees are friendlier, prices are lower, paperwork is more manageable. Well, the post office does something that the DMV doesn't, and that is they compete with the private sector. I don't have to go through the post office to send things to people. I can use UPS, FedEx, etc. So there's pressure on the post office to provide a pleasant experience that's not on the DMV or a good majority of government programs and services. Just imagine how much better government would be if every service, program, agency, etc. was run like the post office. And speaking of the post office, another point that was brought up was, well, how exactly would voluntary taxation work? There isn't really any one particular way to answer this question. It could work any number of ways. The example I gave in the debate involved like a different type of tax form where you could specify what government services you wanted and which ones you didn't want. Which would work. It's not a bad example, but what I probably should have done is list off examples of voluntary taxation that are already implemented. This would have been rather effective since Anton is trying to make the argument that voluntary taxation wouldn't work. Well, these examples of voluntary taxation that are already on the books would be direct and empirically verifiable counterexamples that he would have to deal with. Now, I already mentioned post office as an example of the way the government can obtain funding voluntarily, but another big one I left out was toll roads. Toll roads can potentially make a huge amount of money. I mean, just think about how much traffic passes over a single point on a big interstate highway at any given moment. Even if you charge something ridiculously low, like a nickel per vehicle, you could easily pay the whole annual maintenance costs for that whole highway within a week. And it's voluntary. You don't have to drive on the toll roads. There's plenty of other roads to take, and there's all kinds of other examples, even vending machines outside government buildings. That's the thing, there's so many different ways the government can collect money voluntarily. It's really only limited by your imagination. And you know, the whole coercive tactic, the whole pointing guns at people and forcing them to pay, I feel like that's a very cop-out kind of strategy to take. Just like, I'm not willing to apply imagination and ingenuity to deal with this problem, I'm just going to say fuck it and point guns. It doesn't seem like the kind of direction I'd want society to go in, you know? Anyways, next I address a common talking point on the left, and that is, well, you may not have agreed to it, but you benefit from it, so you still have to pay. I have a ton of problems with this line of reasoning. First of all, this obligation would be literally impossible to enforce because there's any number of things you benefit from, and because the obligation to pay in this instance is based on mere benefit alone rather than your consent, you quite literally end up with infinite debt. So that counterpoint wasn't really mentioned in the debate, but this other one was. And that is, this whole logic that benefit alone creates an obligation to pay seems to always stop at government services. It never seems to extend to private sector services, because all the time there's private sector services that you benefit from, although you didn't overtly agree to use them. I give the example of going to my friend's house to watch a sports game. I never overtly agreed to sign up for the cable service, but I happen to be benefiting from it. Should the cable company still be allowed to send me a bill? His rebuttal at this point doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to me. He makes the point that the payment mechanisms are different. Well, yeah, they are. I kinda knew that. Yeah, there's different payment mechanisms, duh. What's at issue here is what justifies the different payment mechanisms. I mean, he briefly describes how the cable company works. You know, you sign a contract in return for the cable service. Well, I don't see why you can't sign a similar contract for the water service. This strikes me as a no true Scotsman fallacy, like water is somehow different from other commodities in the market just because. At this point we kind of get into the whole free rider problem, the idea of public goods. There's certain things that are difficult to exclude from non-payers. How do we deal with that? And at this point he makes another argument that kind of strikes me as bizarre. On the one hand, he argues that a system of voluntary taxation wouldn't work because people are greedy, selfish, wouldn't fund it, whatever the case may be, but at the same time people will come together and agree to all chip into these things. Well, a system where people come together and agree to chip into these things is kind of what I'm advocating for. If people would come together and agree to chip in for these things, why do we need coercion? But what's more problematic about this position is that it kind of takes a contradictory stance. It's saying that people are both willing and unwilling to fund government programs voluntarily. He mentions the tragedy of the commons, which, as I've discussed in my response video, is actually an argument in favor rather than against property rights. That's a common misconception about it. The only reason none of the farmers have to worry about the resources they consume is because it's communal. If it was partitioned into pieces and each farmer was only allowed to use their plot of land, they couldn't just go take someone else's. The point of the tragedy of the commons is kind of to try and get across that a society that uses resources efficiently kind of has to have property rights. But I digress. Anyways, back to the whole public goods argument. So Anton asks, well, how do you exclude people from clean air who don't want to pay the EPA or something along those lines? And what immediately came to mind, like like a light bulb in my head is like, okay, well, who said it's just the EPA keeping the air clean? There's a shit ton of environmental nonprofits out there. And at this point, the conversation kind of segues into how effective environmental regulations are at protecting the environment. That wasn't necessarily the point I was trying to get across there. More what I was trying to get across was that pretty much anything the government does, there's a private sector equivalent. There's private roads, there's private police, there's private healthcare, education, etc. Since these are the same exact services that the government is providing, couldn't these companies providing these services also use similar justifications to force people to pay against their will? And this is another instance I was trying to point out of the idea that the government should have special rights and powers just because it's the government. That was more or less the point I was trying to get across there, but anyways, because the conversation kind of gets sidetracked at this point, there was another counter-argument I was going to bring up, and that is the free rider problem isn't actually a problem, it's a pseudo-problem. See, there's no a priori requirement that people who take advantage of something or benefit from it pay for it. How many of you here are subscribed to YouTube Red? See, a lot of you are benefiting from and taking advantage of YouTube right now, but aren't paying Google anything for it. In fact, you're probably not paying Google anything for any of the services they provide. Like, Google is free, so is Gmail and Google Drive up to a certain data amount. I think it's like the first 2 gigabytes are free, and then after that you have to pay, but whatever. Point being is that there are ways to capture the cost of these so-called public goods. One of the most prominent examples of this is advertising. Google, as well as many other websites, are able to offer their services to the public for free because they get advertising revenue. Who's to say that the government can't have roads that are free to drive on but sell roadside ad space? And have you ever noticed whenever you go to a store like Walmart, they don't expect you to pay to use the parking lot, you can just park there? In fact, you don't even have to park there to shop at Walmart. You could park at the Walmart parking lot, then walk over to the rural farms across the street. If Walmart has a quick and convenient way for you to park your car there, you're more likely to shop there. Thus, Walmart benefits from these so-called freeloaders. Now, in terms of public infrastructure, do you think any business would fare that well if they didn't have a road connection? Now, within the context of the environment, if I'm in charge of, say, a lake resort, if the lake becomes polluted, nobody's going to want to stay at my resort, so I have an incentive to fund environmental protection programs, even though other people may be quote-unquote freeloading off of it. So as it turns out, freeloading really isn't that big of a problem. In fact, if it was, then you'd have to be against the income tax, because the income tax basically enables people who earn less but use more government services to piggyback off of the people who earn more but use less government services. Anyways, the debate kind of wraps up on the topic of environmental protections and how effective they are. Simply put, in a libertarian society where you have property rights, you're directly held responsible for any environmental harm you cause. If anything, these environmental regulations are nothing but a pay-to-pollute racket. You know, the company gets slapped with some paltry fine, which is a fraction of what they'd actually owe if they were responsible for the property owners whose property they damaged. And we've seen shit like cap and trade, you know, where the companies are basically in bed with the government. They get these sweet little deals going on where it's like, if you pay us, we'll let you pollute. And that shit frankly wouldn't fly in a libertarian society. If you're damaging my property through pollution, I can go after you in court. He makes the assumption that these environmental nonprofits wouldn't have the force of law. Well, of course they would. If you're damaging my property and I can prove it, I'm going to go after you in court. And of course, Anton goes off in this whole authoritarian feel about how they need to be able to go in there and wag their finger and say, listen, motherfucker, you know, in a very confrontational way. Again, this kind of goes back to what I was mentioning before, the whole difference between the cooperative and combative approach. Why do we have to focus on punishments? Why can't we focus on, you know, rewards or positive incentives? Like there could be some green seal of approval that companies get if they're good to the environment or something along those lines. Or companies that fund environmental cleanups, you know, they get PR out of that. And the free market already kind of does incentivize companies to be good to the environment because the free market encourages efficient resource use. For example, the oil refining industry used to produce a ton of pollution because after the oil was refined, once the gasoline was extracted, everything else was just dumped into the water. Well, some entrepreneurs came along and said, well, we can reuse these byproducts. We can make plastic and rubber and asphalt and shit like that. This vastly reduced the amount of pollution that the oil industry produced. And even today, we see companies investing in like wind and solar and hydrogen for their business because if they can reduce their electricity costs, that saves them money, that increases their profit. So see, it's not just about threatening punishments. I think a good part of it is offering positive incentives. And then he makes the point that these government inspectors would have the right to trust trespass. I feel like in doing this, he's kind of conceding my point that the state is morally dubious and that it has special powers and privileges the rest of us don't have, or at least it's perceived as such. And it goes back to that point I mentioned earlier about people having these expectations of government, that they're maybe not omnipotent, but have potence above the average person. They're superhuman. They have powers that we mere Homo sapiens don't. Do you know what? If you need to trespass on someone else's property to prevent a greater harm, that's the necessity principle. That applies to everyone. You don't have to be a bureaucrat. Like if someone's factory is polluting the air to the point that I can't breathe, under the non-aggression principle, I'd have the right to actually go onto their property and take action to stop it, to preserve my life. This isn't a special right that only politicians are endowed with. He also makes the argument that these regulations are like a condition of doing business in this space. Well, what do you mean by space? If by space you mean my business's property, then fuck off, it's my property. Again, I can't tell people what they can and can't do on their own property, and government is made up of the same Homo sapiens as I am, so why should they have that power? Whatever you define as in this space, you're going to have to make that clear and explain what gives government the right to control that space. Because again, it's not legitimate to make rules for property that you don't own. And then he makes the point that this will be reactive rather than proactive. Like these environmental nonprofits would just be playing catch up after the pollution happened, and that these government regulations will somehow magically stop the pollution in the first place. Well, I mean, any approach you take is going to be reactive to an extent. I mean, unless you think these regulators should be taking a minority report approach and punishing these companies before they pollute, I'm not sure exactly what you have in mind as far as these regulations being more proactive. And can you explain to me where the government gets all this clairvoyant power that the rest of us don't have? I mean, why can't these private sector environmental nonprofits take proactive action? I mean, does government have some crystal ball that they don't? You could have these environmental nonprofits make some sort of deal with these companies where it's like, if you let us inspect everything that you do, we'll in return give you our seal of approval or whatever reward they give. Now back to the idea of the property owners, going after these companies. Anton sort of makes a big deal about how difficult it would be to pinpoint what factory is polluting the air. Well, I mean, not really. I mean, smokestacks aren't exactly something, that are easy to hide. And if the pollution is at the point where it's actually starting to affect your ability to, use your property, there's a good chance it'll be pretty obvious where the thick black clouds of smoke are coming from. And pollution that heavy is probably going to affect a lot of people, not just one specific person, but a whole area of people. Well, everyone being affected will have an interest in doing something about that pollution, so they can band together, create a nice big resource pool that they can use to go after this company. Anton, of course, criticizes this as being more complicated than the government regulatory system, but if you take a minute to think about it, it really isn't. I mean, think about it. In order to have regulations passed, you would have to lobby and campaign the government. There would still be a need for people to band together to do something about it. Of course, Anton makes the argument that these regulations are already on the books, so there's no need to worry about that. I feel that kind of misses the point, though, because the same level of effort by the community was exerted at that point. So the point I was trying to kind of get across there is that this system I propose would require no greater amount of community involvement than the democratic system that he proposes. Of course, there's issues of just because regulations are on the books doesn't mean those regulations are sufficient, or that, the government will actually carry through with them. And then Anton says, okay, well, we'll just, fix it, pass the right reforms. Okay, same problem, though, that still requires community involvement. And probably way more community involvement than my system I propose, because in this case, there's no market signals going on. The government is guaranteed their money. Where in my system, you'd be able to choose everything. You could choose your lawyers, choose your courts, choose your environmental nonprofit you're working with. You can choose everything. So if someone is kind of dragging their feet, you don't have to put up with it. And of course, if we have a system where courts are privatized, where there's no bar association making lawyers more expensive, the litigation process, the process by which disputes are arbitrated will be much more simple. Now at this point, Anton asks me how exactly the litigation system would be different under libertarianism, and truth be told, my mind kind of blanks for a minute or two. I kind of say, I don't know off the top of my head, and he criticizes this as being unconvincing. But the thing is, that's just the thing about the free market. There's no one right way of doing things, so I honestly don't know off the top of my head. Maybe someone will come along and innovate a way of doing courts that are more efficient, that I simply can't foresee. And of course, he uses the go-to teams of lawyers argument, like, oh, this big company will just hire teams of lawyers and, you won't stand a chance against them in court. Well, first of all, there will no longer be a bar association monopolizing the practice of law, so you can afford your own team of lawyers as well. As a matter of fact, you may not even need lawyers. Without bar associations, handcuffing paralegals, you may be able to get the legal services you need at a lower price. The second assumption it makes is that simply having more lawyers in and of itself would give you an advantage. Maybe under our current system it does, but not under a libertarian system. You see, under libertarianism, the laws are based on objective logic, not the arbitrary whims of politicians. This makes the laws much more straightforward and easy to understand. Having more lawyers under this type of system wouldn't in and of itself give you an advantage. And this is sort of the point I was trying to get at the end before it cut off. I kind of said, yeah, it's kind of like saying you can make 2 + 2 = 5 if you hire enough mathematicians. Because when you have a Kantian type objective system, the morality has the rigor of mathematics and logic. It becomes more difficult to bend the system to your favor under those conditions. And this brings me to my final point I want to make before I close this out. And this is something I was going to point out, but we were kind of running out of time at this point. But it's sort of a major inconsistency with Anton's whole reasoning. If a company can dodge any sort of responsibility in court by simply amassing enough legal resources, why can't they also amass legal resources to skirt these regulations? Companies do that. They hire teams of lawyers to help them skirt regulations, find loopholes, find ways around regulations. In fact, even before that, in the legislative stage, they usually hire lobbyists to tailor the regulations to be more favorable to them. They'll even oftentimes get people sympathetic to their position in those offices. This is a phenomenon known as regulatory capture, where instead of the government regulating businesses, the businesses now regulate the government. And this is a big problem with regulations. As a matter of fact, I'm surprised it didn't come up in the debate. It's such a big issue. And it's an issue you'll never have with UL or the BBB or anything like that. And that pretty much sums up all my thoughts. Again, my intention here was just to kind of clarify some things I didn't have a chance to fully explain, address some counter-arguments from Anton I didn't quite get around to, just things like that. But yeah, it was a good debate, definitely an interesting one. Good points are made on both sides. I encourage everyone to go ahead and watch it. Once again, big thank you to Anton Dybal for having me on the show. It was a huge pleasure, had a lot of fun, look forward to more debates in the future. Also, if anyone else is interested in debating me, feel free to message me, let me know. I'll be happy to set something up. Until next time, this has been Philosophossum, making stupidity play dead. Have a good one.